in the 50s now. Was there some time you spent in the Philippines?
Yes.
before?
Well, what happened was, while living and working in Korea, a war began. The North invaded in June the 25th, 1950. I was living in Seoul, capital of South Korea, which is only a few miles from the border, where the tanks came over in the middle of the night. And we were in deep doo-doo. And so we had to flee. Cargo planes were flown into Kimpo Airfield, and we were rushed out to board those planes and fly to Japan in safety. Shortly after that, the Americans committed troops to the defense of South Korea. To me, one of the great proofs of the efficacy of public relations and persuasion is that during the initial stages, when the North Koreans occupied almost all of South Korea except for one beachhead around the city of Busan, there were no defections. The South Koreans stayed loyal to the West, to America. Why do they do that? Well, I think part of the reason is because we had a good information program, and we had exposed America, the United States, as a model to follow for the South Koreans. And they had had a free election. And we promoted the use of the Korean language. One of the most interesting things to me personally was that I noticed that the American embassy in 1949, early 50, had brought over some intelligent people, scholarly people, to write a newspaper and to produce a daily newspaper. And I noticed that after they produced the paper and it was printed, piles of them were still stacked up around the embassy. Piles of these papers were stacked up, and they weren't being delivered. And there were various distribution systems that the embassy tried to establish for the newspapers. And my boss, Jim Stewart, said, "John, why don't you figure out how to get these things out to the people who should read them?" So I went out to the villages in Korea, and I discovered that every village had a senior man, sort of as the unofficial local mayor, or he was called the Yangban, and he wore a funny hat, and he was distinguished and deferred to, and he was wise, and he had a name, and he had an address. And so I started collecting the names and addresses of the Yangbans of the villages of Korea, and then put other people to work doing it. And back at the embassy in Seoul, we started addressing the newspapers to the Yangban and mailing them to them. One thing the Japanese were very good at in the occupation of Korea was roads and telegraph and mail service and schools. The mail worked fine. So we mailed them. The Koreans loved it. They got a piece of mail. So the Yangban would read the newspaper, giving credence to the propaganda we were issuing. This had a powerful effect. The proof of it was that when the North Koreans This simple device of sending the newspapers, which otherwise were useless, direct to the Yangbans with their name and address, gave dignity to the recipient. He would read the paper to the local people. The paper was in Korean, not in Japanese or English. We built up an enormous amount of support and goodwill in South Korea by the simplest and most inexpensive of all possible projects. I like that. I thought, hot dog. Now I'm learning something about public relations. It's a true story. When we got kicked out of Korea by the fate of the war, going down to the Pusan beachhead, Pusan perimeter as it was called, I was transferred from Tokyo to Manila to help develop and build and operate a printing plant that would produce propaganda or PR materials for Southeast Asia, for U.S. Information Agency. State Department did not like the notion of getting into practical business things. They liked diplomacy, flowery notes, cocktail sipping, la-di-da. But a printing plant, good God, greasy, messy. But that printing plant ran for 30 years after it was set up to produce PR materials, from surrender leaflets to prayers in the initial stages of the war in Vietnam. And the production of that printing plant was also used in the Philippines and got people interested in and connected with learning local languages, because they had to be printed in languages appropriate to the Philippines and to Indonesia and to Indochina and to Malaysia, Burma, Thailand. And that helped to develop American scholarly interest and broaden American interest in those languages and therefore those peoples. Mm-hmm. So I worked there for quite a while and traveled into other parts of Asia, seeing what kind of printed materials would be useful in promoting democracy and fighting communism. It was practical PR. I should have paid them for the job. It was so much fun, and I learned so much.
Well, let's look at kind of winding our discussion up. But one thing
I think we've been speaking for about 4 or 5 days, haven't we?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. I don't know if this has been of any use to you at all.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Let me ask you quickly if, for what accomplishment are you most proud of in your life? Can you put your finger on something and say, oh, I know what that is?
Bayanihan.
Say that again.
Bayanihan. Bayanihan. Bayanihan.
Want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I thought everybody knew about it. Goodness gracious. These are Bayanihan girls.
Okay.
Here's the problem. After World War II, and after the independence granted to the Philippines by the Tidings-McDuffie Act took place in 1946, and after the Hukbalahaps, to some extent, were subdued in central Luzon. These were the revolutionaries, the left-wing revolutionaries, and the people in the Muslims in in the southern islands of the Philippines, notably Mindanao, were pacified. And things were back to sort of normal by 1950. This is 5 years after the war, 55. Things were calm. The university students were radicalized, as they had been in the United States. If you remember the 50s and 60s in the United States, well, copycat. Philippines was like that. There were all these left-wing, beard-growing hippies of Philippine-type hippies and so on and so forth. And they wanted to. They didn't want to go and fight with the rebels, as it were, but they wanted to. There were strikes, there were parades, there were marches, there was all this agitation. And one of the big complaints among these young people, who were to be the intellectuals and to be the teachers of the future for the country, was that everything was Uncle Sam's fault. The reason we don't have it, the reason we aren't, the reason we can't, it was all Uncle Sam's fault. And so the propaganda internally in the Philippines was against anything American. Uncle Moneybags and so on and so forth. Well, you have two ways to go at that sort of problem. You can say, they can say, you're the bad guy, and you can say, no, I'm not. So you have the denial avenue. No, I didn't. No, I can't. No, I won't. Or you can use enfilade PR. I love the enfilade system. That's where you shoot from the side. Instead of straight back or back and forth, you shoot from the angle. Enfilade PR. Just as American culture was being decried by Philippine so-called self-established or self-styled nationalists, a little group was forming called Bayanihan. Bayanihan, it comes from the word bayan, meaning people, and Bayanihan, people working together. Great concept. And it was the name of a dance group. It was a group started at the Philippine Women's University. You like the sound of this already, don't you? And they had gone out and done a lot of research through the PE department, physical education, because dancing is healthy. But later through the whole university. And they had learned that in all these islands, 7,100 islands of the Philippines, there were all different kinds of dances and songs and musical instruments. And you could say, well, there was no national Deutschland über alles. No, they had something stronger. They had this whole woven network. Bayanihan working together. What a great thing to promote. To be in favor of Philippine culture. All they needed was recognition outside their own country. The way to get recognition, drill the company, take them on tour. Send back the newspaper clippings of how well they were received in Paris or in Washington. And all of a sudden, and that's what happened, and all of a sudden in the Philippines, there were a dozen more Bayanihan groups all over the country promoting their own culture, saying we're proud of our culture. Nobody ever paid attention to our culture before. We have it now, and it's wonderful, and it's beautiful. And all the critics of America are gone because there is something that's live and wonderful. That's great. 50th anniversary of Bayanihan is in October this year. I'll be going out to Manila.
Okay. Excellent.
That's a PR program in the way of no press releases, but in the way of an action that has the result that's positive and useful, and at the same time, without saying so, crushes all these complaints. That's PR in action, I think.